Sorry about Singapore. No, everything. No, I think just what was the subject?
We made a saying that he was probably Russian.
Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests in Heritage, checking that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online, you are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our discussion, Dr. Anderson is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles in Public Policy. He is also the founder and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. He is the author of Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, by two U.S. Supreme Court justices, both Justice Alito and Clarence Thomas, in two separate Supreme Court cases. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton, and he received his doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Anderson.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone, for coming. America lost a clear thinker and a dear friend with the passing of Michael Novak on February 17th of this year. Novak was committed to rightly ordered liberty and cared deeply about the principles and practices that produce it. While a longtime fellow institute, Michael was no stranger to the Heritage Foundation. He delivered a seminal lecture here in 2009 on the true meaning of social justice. And just last July, he was the keynote speaker for the launch of Heritage's Index of Culture and Opportunity. Michael's enormous body of work emphasizes the cultural prerequisites for political, as he stressed that economic conservatism and social conservatism are indivisible. In the words of Heritage Foundation founder Dr. Ed Fulner, quote, Michael forced those of us trained in the dismal science of economics to explain that we should be more than free to choose. Rather, we should be free to make good free choices. And his example and encouragement helped form many scholars, and his thoughts equipped a generation of policymakers to defend a free and virtuous society. And so today we will hear from some of those scholars that he encouraged, all of whom had the great fortune of calling him a friend. First up will be Catherine Pakulak. Dr. Pakulak is an assistant school of business and economics at the Catholic University of America. Catherine received her PhD in economics from Harvard University, and she was the 2015 recipient of the Acton Institute's Novak Award, a prize given for significant contribution to the study between religion and economic liberty. Upon receipt of the Novak Award, Dependence on God and Man Toward a Catholic Constitution of Liberty. Next up will be Sam Gregg. Sam, unfortunately, is stuck in a Detroit airport due to snow. And so I will read the remarks that he prepared. Sam's the director of research at the Acton Institute and the author of several books on themes including On Ordered Liberty, A Treatise on the Free Society, and Economic Thinking for the Theologically Minded. Sam is the editor of a fresh shrift for Michael titled Theologian and Philosopher of Liberty, Essays of Evaluation and Criticism in honor of Michael Novak. Speaking third is the Distinguished Senior Fellow and the William E. Simon Chair at the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in D.C. George is the author of many books, including Witness to Hope, the biography of John Paul II, and he's a longtime collaborator of Michael's to such a great extent that the name Newhouse Weigel Novak was coined to describe the three of them. Finally will be Mary Eberstadt. Mary is an essayist, a novelist, and the author of several influential books, including most recently, It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution, and How the West Really Lost God, a new theory of a longtime collaborator of Michael's on projects such as the Academy of Catholic Thinkers and Artists and the Kirkpatrick Society. So we'll hear from the four panelists, and then we'll have an opportunity to hear your questions. And if there's time, we'll also hear the panel's answers. Thank you.
It's great to see a lot of familiar faces here. So I'm going to just give a couple of brief remarks introducing, I think, maybe one of the sort of explanation for why it is that Novak was a great economist, speaking as an economist, and most people wouldn't call Michael Novak an economist, but I'm going to make the case. I do want to give a kind of a small testimony to his character. There are many things that one could say, and I couldn't possibly start in terms of my personal interaction with Novak. But one thing I want to say, especially in this town and in this location, is that Michael Novak's personal care for his friends I believe was completely unparalleled among intellectual elites. So Michael's someone with staggering, intellectual capability and life, but the care that he offered to his friends in this sense, I think, is really unparalleled. So, he has one to make all kinds of jokes about the way that academics typically relate to each other and to other people, but Michael was really, his warmth and his care for people and his friends was very particular. It was very specific, and I think it was kind of pragmatic in a way that, as I thought about it, reflecting on his life, that sort of pragmatism, the American temperament, and that Michael really practiced in his. So, with his friends and his students, it was often, well, what specifically do you need? Do you need $500 for a conference? Do you need me to call a potential donor? Do you need me to introduce you to someone? That kind of unique and personal. But again, if you spend a lot of time in Washington Circle, I didn't have that much care for my dissertation committee supervisor. But the kind of thing that Novak would do on a regular basis. And that after his death, those of us who know his students and so on, this was coming out all over the place. So there wasn't just me, and it wasn't just many people in this room. So the thing I want to say about Michael as an economist is something like this. Around the time that Michael passed, I was studying for other purposes the 1964 James Buchanan's comments about what should economists do. And I was doing this for a course and kind of reflecting on it again. I hadn't read this in probably more than 20 years. And Buchanan kind of laments. Buchanan's writing in the 60s, and he goes on to win the Nobel Prize in the 80s. So this is one of the leading economists of the 20th century. And he laments in this essay that economics as a well-defined discipline or subject seems to be disintegrating. It's for that disintegration as a field, he says, as a field of scholarship. All of the reasons he gives for that disintegration have only gotten worse since then. So it was a highly prophetic set of arguments, I think. And what did he propose? What did Buchanan propose? What are the reasons he thought things were disintegrating? And one of the reasons is he thought economists really didn't know what they were up to. The subject matter was. So, this is interesting. And it's true today that if you were to gather up 10 academic economists in a room and ask them what it is that economics is about, you would get 10 different answers. And this isn't necessarily, leading to disintegration, but I think in this case, the argument can be made. I would make the argument that economists don't seem to know their subject matter. And what does he offer? Buchanan says, well, what should economists be about? What should they be thinking about? And he says, in a manner of speaking, economists should be about studying these propensities in human nature. And then, in particular, he quotes Smith. He quotes Adam Smith, the propensities to truck, barter, and exchange form of human nature, which lends itself to market activity. And then he says, and then you should go on not only to study these things, but also the institutional arrangements that cause markets and exchange to flourish. And so he sort of develops this thesis. And he builds his argument on both Smith and Lord Acton a little bit. And to Sam's comments on the legacy of the spirit of democratic capitalism, that this is what Michael Novak does, that he takes up this task in terms of thinking about propensities in human nature to build and exchange for markets and to think about characteristic human activities. Formal economists do anymore. So, those of you who know the work of formal economists, this is not what economists do anymore. Are we surprised that Novak, in some sense, as a theologian, someone who was trained as a seminarian, had a deeply philosophical and theological background, he takes up the task that Buchanan runs with it, and he does what it is that Buchanan says economists have stopped doing. And should we be surprised? And it's it's certainly the case that Novak's education and training was a lot more like Adam Smith's and Lord Acton's than it is like anyone today possessing a PhD in economics. So I don't think we should be very surprised, and this should pose some how we might best educate people to continue and pick up and think about the great questions in political economy in the way that Novak did and the way that Smith and Lord Acton did. It might not be to give them a formal training in economics. So I want to stop there and let Sam comment on the consequences of this.
Thank you. So he says, thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting today's event in honor of our friend Michael Novak. Michael had a great impact on the lives of the people on this panel and in this room today. But perhaps the most significant impact for which he will be remembered was his book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. It is underscored by the fact that Novak initially had difficulty finding a publisher. His traditional mainstays refused to touch it. In fact, the year of the book's publication, 1982, was not a happy year more generally. A severe recession gripped America. Many were beginning to wonder if unemployment in Britain hit a post-war high. Across the Channel, Francois Mitterrand was busy nationalizing banks and raising taxes. Daniel Ortega's Sandinistas were firmly in control of Nicaragua. The Soviet grip on Eastern Europe seemed tighter than ever. Solidarity appeared finicky as a declaration of a state of war against his own country. In the Middle East, Lebanon was descending into anarchy, and just to the northeast, Syria's president was ordering his security forces to level the town of Hama. Thousands subsequently died. Some things never change. There was, however, the occasional bright spot amidst Britain liberated the Falklands, thereby precipitating the collapse of Argentina's military junta. Another bright spot, I'd suggest, was the publication of The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. From our 2017 vantage point, it's easy to forget just how innovative this book was. In penning The Spirit, Michael was the first political case for the market economy in a systematic way. Needless to say, Novak's book generated fierce reactions from the religious left, but also from sections of the right. The opprobrium was probably heightened by the fact that The Spirit confirmed what had become evident from the mid-70s onward, that Novak was well. 35 years ago, however, many Christians, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, clerical, and lay, were marching in precisely the opposite direction. Theologians in the Americas and Western Europe were waxing lyrical about dialogue with Marxism. Liberation theology was rife in much of Latin America, issuing what seemed to be an stream of commentaries about economic subjects about which they had no special competence as bishops, and which invariably reflected a mildly center-left line. Then, in 1986, the Bishops' Conference published Economic Justice for All, a document which bore all the hallmarks of Rawls and non-entertaining, had said all that ever needed to be said about justice and the economy. But unlike economic justice, Novak's spirit continues to provide inspiration today, something not limited to Americans. Its samizdat reflected the fact that those who actually experienced real socialism not only knew that collectivism had failed, they also understood that there was no third way. At the same time, Central Eastern Europeans weren't impressed with merely utilitarian or efficiency arguments for markets. They wanted to root free markets in a ritual they were looking for in Novak's spirit. Naturally, some of Novak's book has been superseded by events, such as communism's defeat in Eastern Europe and the former USSR, and the rise of a new generation of bishops and priests who know that economic policy is largely a matter of prudential judgment for the laity. And yet, we have a Catholic mind that takes seriously Adam Smith's economic and philosophical insights. The affirmation that markets must be grounded upon particular moral, political, and legal habits and institutions. The attention to how awareness of the reality of sin should incubate us against economic utopianism, and perhaps above all, with a vision of God, giving it genuine theological meaning. All of these intellectual forays helped facilitate serious reconsideration of the moral merits of market economies by not only Catholics, but also other Christians and Jews. Many hitherto prevailing visions of capitalism, such as the suddenly seemed open to question. Across the world, books and articles began appearing that engaged the ideas which Novak had articulated. In retrospect, it's difficult to dispute the trajectory between particular themes contained within the spirit and some of the positive statements about the market economy found in John Paul II's 19... Perhaps the most significant effect was upon thousands of business leaders and entrepreneurs throughout the world. Novak had managed to put into words something they instinctively knew, that their daily labor was not a mere necessary evil. Instead, business could be understood as a calling from God or to simultaneously transform themselves in the direction of the good. In short, it wasn't just that, given the right settings, free markets helped diminish poverty quickly. It was also possible to find a spark of the divine in the very activity of business itself. Not surprisingly, Novak's spirit as an effort to sanctify an essentially immoral system. It also draws heat from those inclined to romanticize a lost world of guilds. If anything, however, the current trajectory of economic policy in America and much of Western Europe tells us just how much we need the insights of the spirit today. Even after the 2008 for free markets, by now, conservatives and free marketers should have learned, but in many cases apparently have not, that they must make stronger, more persuasive moral arguments in debates about political economy instead of treating such matters as subjective, relative, or clever tactics, a ceaseless battle with those who put their faith in top-down planning, social democracy, and the welfare state. Morality is as much part of the truth about reality as supply and demand. The most insightful economists, ranging from Adam Smith to Wilhelm Röpke, have all its long-term significance. Michael Novak's magnum opus continues to ask anyone who cares about liberty to look up and see that the truth about man, economic, cultural, political, moral, and theological, is by its very nature indivisible. We consequently neglect any part of it.
Yes, Sam. Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for inviting us all to be here today. About American exceptionalism. Some people deplored it. Some people celebrated it. It wasn't quite clear what most people were talking about when they talked about it. It certainly seems to me that one way in which our republic in the 21st century is that there is among us an argument, a debate, an ongoing conversation about religion and public life unlike anywhere else in the Western world. This doesn't happen in the United Kingdom, it doesn't happen in Italy, it doesn't happen in Spain. Remarkably enough, it doesn't happen in Poland, but it does happen here. Now, one could say that's always been the case. We remember Witherspoon and the founding. We remember Reinhold in the 20th century. We remember John Courtney Murray and the American Catholic effort to find a Catholic argument for the democratic project. But I think it's striking that as America has become more secular at various levels, religion and public life has in fact intensified over the past 40 years. And by that, I don't mean things like the moral majority or the political pronouncements of clergy of various denominations. I mean the argument, the biblical religion, has to bring to the table as we sort out the American project in a post-Cold War world. And as that debate intensified, perhaps somewhat paradoxically, given everything else that was going on, you found, as I noted in my memorial piece in National Review Online, Michael's work here in Washington, where he finally landed after a peregrination that took him to a number of odd academic institutions, SUNY, the final 64, excuse me. the year Michael died. So maybe his intercession is only of a terrestrial nature when it comes to basketball. But he landed in Washington. I have powerfully struggled with this in my own wanderings over the past 30 years. There simply is nothing like this kind of a discussion in London, Paris, Bonn, Berlin, Madrid, Lisbon, Rome, Warsaw. Had a great deal to do with it. But while his work helped shape the exceptional character of Washington as a world capital where religious ideas are taken seriously, the impact of his ideas has already made I think what was crucially important there was that through the mediation of his friend Rocco Buttiglione, an Italian philosopher who had actually gone to Poland to study philosophy with Karol Rocco, Michael helped effect a fundamental shift in Catholic social doctrine, which from Leo XIII through Paul VI, from 1891 through the mid-1970s, had been characterized by a kind of thought of wealth as stuff. Wealth was either stuff in the ground or the ground itself, in a rural sense, or what you made out of stuff in the ground. But wealth was stuff. And because wealth was stuff, real estate, there was a fixed pie of stuff. And in a fixed pie of stuff, the primary moral question becomes the equitable distribution of that stuff, the just distribution of that stuff. What Buttiglione through Michael that did not describe wealth in the post-industrial world. Wealth was not just stuff. Wealth was ideas, entrepreneurial energies, risk-taking capacities, prudence, became a source of wealth in which more and more people could participate. And if the pie is growing, then the fundamental moral question shifts from distribution to inclusion. Who is the wealth of nations, which is in the mind of human beings, is applied to stuff so that wealth is created. That was a huge shift. I mean, far more, frankly, than anything the Pope said positively about what he preferred to call the free economy or to a new development, which remains to be followed up, frankly, because there's been some what we might call backsliding since then. But even more importantly than that, in Centesimus Annus, was the influence of Michael on John Paul II. And that was the notion that in this tripartite free society, a democratic polity, a free economy, a vibrant public moral culture, it was the culture that it takes a certain kind of people living certain virtues to make democracy and the market function so that the net result is genuine human flourishing, not human degradation. I think the importance of that in democracy is ever more evident today, that really is the crucial question of our times. If we sense that we are in a crisis of political culture manifest in an extraordinarily vulgar presidential campaign last year, political culture is rooted in a crisis of moral culture, and at the root of that is a crisis in the very idea of the human person. And that, interestingly enough, brings us back to Michael's original fascination as a thinker. There wasn't a whole lot said in the memorial tributes to him about his book, The Experience of Nothingness, where he explored in a very powerful way by the hollow shrine at the heart of secular modernity. And it was striking to me that when he came back to the seminar that we had founded some 25 years before in Krakow for the last time, it was that part of the program, which was fine, but Michael wanted to talk about these deeper philosophical questions of the nature of the human person. And I think those reflections of his, the fact, which I think is a fact, that its cultural foundations are crumbling, and that crumbling threatens both free politics and free economics. The day Michael died, I ago, when I was 20 years old, or 19 years old at the time, and an article of his, an essay of his, was assigned in a sophomore theology class. What is theology's standpoint? And Michael's point was that theology, disciplined reflection on religious experience, if you will, stands at that open, and that includes homo politicus and homo economicus. And that brings us back at the end, of course, to American exceptionalism. It's our loss of that tether find in political culture, moral culture, crisis in the idea of the human person today. And therefore, it's the entire corpus of Michael Novak's work that I believe will be of continued relevance in the decades and perhaps even.
Bring us together to celebrate Michael. Once upon a time, there was a lion, and the lion had a voice like a lamb. In more ways than one. For one thing, of all those who move in the kingdom of ideas, his territory was the largest and most expansive. Theology, philosophy, poetry, fiction, diplomacy, and so often Michael seemed to be quiet and in repose, only to leap faster and more powerfully into intellectual action than anyone else. He could see what other people couldn't. He could pounce on ideas in motion. Third, he was also a lion in the sense that he deserves all the lionization he's received, and more. It's hard to think of any other figure whose passing has been the occasion for quite so many youth. George and Catherine and Sam Gregg and I were actually present at Michael's 80th birthday party, which was at Ave Maria several years back. It was an all-day and night affair. The next morning he said, "Why did you leave so early? We were going to the next pub for another drink." Today I'd like to share just a few thoughts about Michael that aren't about his leonine mind, but instead about his lion side. My happiest memories of him and the Novak family are not set in this hard-edged town, but instead in dreamy Delaware, where we visited often in a happy little kingdom by the sea. ideas over leisurely lunches and dinners or afternoon tea. I know most of his favorite meals in most of the restaurants in that little town. He was especially fond of something called a Templeton martini at one of the local places. Even greater charm was that it came with a sidecar. We built castles of our own in the air during these times. We had ongoing visions of new articles, new books that seemed just I remember batting around possible titles for his last nonfiction book. I suggested calling it What Social Justice Is and Isn't. And the lion nodded and replied, "That's good." Memory is one of so many in which Michael effortlessly improved a notion, a thought, a turn of phrase, or some new world in the making. We dreamed about institution building, and ideas for new kinds of fellowship. One of these, a dream about a new institute for artists and writers, came to life just in Michael's last year. Another was from his understanding of why an association of women might be an especially apt idea in these politicized times. Still, other institutions remain to be midwifed, but if they ever appear, for other thinkers. The salon that was the Novak home in Delaware during the summers burst with energy, music, and love. The Novak family would during the last years especially, would burst into song, play guitars, arrange impromptu musicales, read their poetry, outdo one another making fabulous dinners. After the Latin. This was their idea of fun. And to me it seemed perfect synecdoche for all that was cultivated and rich about everything in the Novak circle. Washington ideas, but they're all the better for that. The first is that one must approach others the way Michael approached them, as minds and souls with needs and requirements. He knew the interests of every student, literal student, figurative student, and encouraged everyone's work. In a city where, as we all know, many people called leaders that nothing lasting, nothing worthwhile of an intellectual or artistic nature is made without risk. Recall that Michael's first book was a novel. So was his last. Time ago, but he never did. How I admire the example he set that way. In 2010, with Michael's encouragement, I published a work to just the right publisher. Later, and this was again at his suggestion, the book became a stage play. It premiered at Catholic University's Hartke Theater in fall 2016, just past. As all the rage, he encouraged the opposite message, that it is risk and difficulty, not comfortable pacing in accustomed places, that has a shot at becoming anything worthwhile. celebrating the play after one of the evening's performances. In the end, and despite all the Michaels, theologian, philosopher, novelist, institution builder, poet, mentor, father, a lion with the voice of a lamb.
Great. Thank you to all of the panelists. We have some time for
roles that wasn't touched on a lot, but
Sorry,
referred to.
wait for a microphone so the people watching at home can hear your question as
Sorry.
well.
One of Michael's roles that was alluded to but wasn't really elaborated on, I'm hoping George would speak more about it, was his service on large-scale role, also with the Center for International Private Enterprise earlier on. Perhaps you could refer to it.
Thanks, John. I'd be happy to, since I currently hold what I think was the Novak. Some folks somewhere recently that of all of Michael's accomplishments, what he did at the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva in 81, 82, President Reagan simply threw him into one of the most corrupt of UN environments and said, start slugging, which he did. So he had to invent this whole thing. He had to invent U.S. human rights policy on the fly. And to give it intellectual substance and ballast, and that was terribly important. Then, 7 years of ideas to help the new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe achieve what they had hoped to achieve in the revolution of conscience that led to the revolution. In the United States, to be the people who carry this legacy into the future. One of those young leaders is sitting on my right, and the night I arrived in Krakow, I was informed by but
See what good you did.
see what good
I haven't danced on a table since.
but you've done so many other great things. So that's a very important point. May I mention just one other important however inelegant it was, when Michael and Ralph McInerney started Catholicism in Crisis, they are sometimes not the most elegant things in the world to look at. But what counted was not the typography and the layout. What counted was the arguments. Then came in the world. Another exceptionalist artifact. And all of that was due to Mike. I mean, that was his energy, ably aided by people like Derek Crow.
Other questions? Yep.
Ryan opened this up by saying that Michael Novak influenced a generation of scholars, and hopefully that will be multiple generations. Look for in the rising generation.
Let me take a very quick cut at that. I know this was on Michael's mind in the last year of his life. more than a few people have fallen through the cracks, and we have to figure out a way to address that. And it has to be done in such a way that we don't kill the engine to be attended to. Michael, somebody quoted Michael in some obituary or other, saying that if he had to take a stand on and a lot of those people are hurting now. And we need to be taking that hurt seriously, not romanticizing it, not ignoring what Hillbilly Elegy points out.
My first pass would be similar. I was going to say that I think that a lot of the work that started, I mean, one could almost chart a course for future scholars by picking up the spirit and looking chapter by it's incredibly deep and rich, and I think people picking it up today expecting to find a kind of light bestseller type popular intellectual track don't find that. It's quite heavy and quite deep, and there are many parts of that I think you could not finished, right, for the reasons that George mentioned, and for other ones it's not finished, and that could be done. And in Michael's pragmatic way, something that he often said, and he used to, I mean, I think it's if they really thought about the causes of wealth. And in the last couple of years, I used to argue with him, and I said, I'm not sure that to bring and marshal the same kinds of arguments and to develop the line of thinking, that it isn't the case that today the question, in fact, most people were not wealthy by any standard, that was when it was most important for people to stop and think about what the causes of wealth are. Certainly, I mean, what I want to the causes of poverty within contemporary Western economic development. What causes that? So I think that question, Michael's original question, which is a kind of genius thing to ask, academic scholars, but also for non-academic scholars.
Yeah, it's sort of paradoxical if you think that, as I do, one of the greatest started those seminars and started all those things he started up until literally his last breaths. There was no obvious need for any of these things quite as he saw them. And the second thing I would observe that I don't think he ever got quite enough credit for was the way he read the left, literally and figuratively. He Catholic readers, because what Michael understood, I think, is that you can't make converts without understanding where the other side is coming from. So, word of general intellectual and moral advice.
Looking at the previous two popes, Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict, both were influenced by Michael Novak quite a bit. I believe Pope Benedict actually received a copy of the book Spirit of Democracy.
I think and we've talked about this in the last two board meetings at First Things, the single biggest failure wheel of the Michael died and asked if they were all saying 2 down, 1 to go here. The single biggest failure has been the and maybe 1 or 2 things that Father Newhouse has done, and we're not the only ones in this project. The project is much larger than any of us. That's a very serious problem. It's particularly serious. Attended, that problem is going to have some rebounds north, east, and west of the Rio Grande River. We need to figure out some way to do something about that.
So with that, please join me in thanking the panelists.